Welcome everyone. In this chess video we're going to discuss the chess variant that I think is actually the best variant there is for beginners. Now I know most beginners will want to stick with regular chess and not dive into variants too much. There's so many different variants out there. There's spell chess, there's duck chess, there's extra large chess. I know it's very tempting to stick with regular chess and do one thing at a time. But if there is one variant that actually can help you, I think it's Fischer Random, which on chess.com will be called Chess 960. And the reason for that is because there are 960 possible combinations of the starting arrangements with the pieces shuffled on the back rank. But everything else is the same. And so why is this actually really useful for beginners? I'm not saying to switch your entire game plan and start playing only this variant, but every now and then it is useful. And so the main reason is because this variant takes away all opening theory. And it actually accentuates some of the main ideas that the regular chess offers. So let's take a look at some examples here and show some tips on how you can actually be really good at this variant and how it can actually help you, especially if you're a beginner. Okay, so the first one here I want to talk about is opening principles, because opening principles are just as important in Fischer Random as with regular chess. It might even be more important than regular chess, and the reason why is because at the very start of the game, all of your pieces are really uncoordinated, and so because of that, you really want to get them off the back rank, and you really want to get them into the play. Okay, so here I'll show a few moves of this game that I played here. So this first move, g3, is already intending to develop this bishop, so that's sort of a developing move already. And I'm just going to focus on my moves, not too much with the opponent, but of course all these ideas will be for both sides. So here's, of course, developing a piece. That's a good developing move. And notice it's kind of strange, too, that in Fischer Random, like here, you would imagine the knight getting to c3. In this case, the knight started here. But really, you still want the knights generally on these four squares, just because they occupy a good portion of the center from those spots. So if I were to look at, like, say, the c3 knight, it's controlling two of the four central squares. So these two of the four in the center are controlled already by this knight. And so that is a really useful thing that does not change regardless of where the pieces start. The center is still an important asset in chess. So after they move, I develop another piece. And then they're probably intending to shadow the bishop or something similar to what I'm doing. I play bishop to g2, get it off the back rank. They actually trade. I'm not really sure why, but I guess they want to double my pawns or something. I just take back. They develop a piece. And now I push f4, which is thinking of opening principles, because here I'm trying to control more of this central square here, and specifically these four squares. So I am influencing the center with this f4 pawn move. They do the same, and now I wanted to keep developing, so I develop another piece, bishop to f2. And now here, kind of funny looking, is me castling. It doesn't look too strange, but in Fischer Random it looks a little different. And I'll talk about castling a little bit later, but here we'll just treat it as a normal developing move, and we get castled. They develop piece as well, and ideally I want to get my queen off the back rank. And I could consider pushing this pawn, but regardless which square I put it, I'm going to be blocking in one of my already developed bishops. And so maybe I'm not really a huge fan of that, but I do want to get the queen off the back rank still. So my idea to get the queen off the back rank is simply play queen e1. And maybe long term, I can either play queen to d2, and then my rooks are finally connected, and we've kind of finished opening principles here, because everything is fully developed. Or in some cases, I might use this queen to help support this pawn move, which again helps influence the center. So in this variant, developing your pieces is still extremely useful, and opening principles can still help you in this variant. Okay, so in this game here, opening principles will also be fairly important, as you know, with the first example, but I want to draw your attention to another point, and that's the castling that I mentioned earlier, because here it's going to be a little bit different in how this affects the strategy of the game. But we'll get to that point when we get there. So first let's show the normal developing moves in this exact game, and show the opening principles that are at play. So again, we play g3, in this case just to get the bishop out, very similar to last game actually. Again, we're developing a piece, trying to control the center. We play d4, again, central move. This pawn move, of course, influencing a central square, so that's good. Then we continue piece development with the knight here. They bring their knight out. And then in this case, I actually saw something a little bit creative, where I thought my bishop might get more active than theirs here on h1 versus theirs on h8 if I play a certain idea. And so once I saw that, I immediately went for it. So the idea is to play this knight to e5, and I figured they're going to try and contest the knight, which they actually did, and then I can play f4, And my whole purpose here is that when they take my knight, I can recapture with the f-pawn. And according to the engine, it's actually not best. I should have actually captured the d-pawn. But my idea was to try and really cut down on this bishop scope and make sure it's really secured. Now, ironically enough, if we were to look at the d-pawn, it's actually the same thing, but this also really looks good as it helps block in their bishop. But either way, I'm trying to keep their bishop inactive, and I thought maybe I could get my bishop more active in play. But that was my idea there. I went f captures, okay, fine. We continue with development, opening principles, because I play bishop to d2, developing a new piece off the back rank. They push a pawn. I improve my knight. They move their bishop. I play b3, trying to get my queen out of the corner. They play queen at a6. I develop my bishop. Of course, I'm going to move my knight that was attacked. I finally get the queen out. And now after a4, we are very close to castling here. Now, we are very close to rooks being connected. And so you have to ask yourself, in which direction do I want to castle? And so this brings me to the second point here, which is, generally speaking, you want to be still following opening principles. And the main opening principles are control the center, develop pieces, and castle early. And all three still apply to this variant, but I will say there might be a slightly more merit compared to regular chess to delaying castling slightly. And the reason why is because when you castle, your king can go very far in this variant and really escape something. Like here, they're playing a4, they're about to rip open my queen side here, and I really don't want to be castled on this side. That could put me in some trouble here. So instead, we play the really funny looking move, which is after taking and bishop takes, I castle. But I castle the other way, which looks kind of funny because you're moving the king so far. And so what is the idea that we have to be aware of here when we're trying to delay castling? So the main idea is in this variant, wherever we castle, imagine that we're playing regular chess. Where would the king and rook end up if we had castled that side? So in regular chess, the king would start on e1. Of course, our rook is on a1. And so if I castle queen side there, my king will end up on c1, and this a1 rook will kind of wrap around to d1. And so in this variant, regardless where the rook or king is starting, that's where the king and rook will end up. And similarly, if I castle king side here, in regular chess, the king would be here, and it would end up on g1, and the h rook would kind of wrap around to f1. Well, the same exact thing happens in this variant, where the king will end up on g1, and the rook will end up on f1, as we see here. So kind of having in mind those squares can really help you, because not only can you escape a lot of danger sometimes in this variant, but there might also be some cool tactics where you can actually set up a rook on an important file, like in this case the f file, which here actually is half open already. And now for the next one, I want to show another key idea that I think is a little bit more specific to this variant. And this is only something that I've done. I haven't really heard too many other people talk about this, but I'm curious if I'm the first one to think of this or if other people have also noticed. But in this variant, even more so than regular chess, I think it's important to think beforehand, where should I be putting my bishops? And the reason why bishops specifically is because the knights will generally belong on these squares, which I already mentioned helps control the center. And so from there, we more or less know where to put those knights. And if the knights don't end up on those squares, knights are flexible enough that they can maneuver all over the board and find a nice spot somewhere. Bishops is a little bit trickier, I think. So they really want a nice long diagonal. And so oftentimes I'm trying to think from even the very beginning, what diagonals do I want my bishops on? In this case, we already have the bishops really nice connected together, like Horowitz bishops. It would be cool if I could get these pawns advanced, and then these bishops could be really strong. And so that's actually my plan here, where I start with this b pawn, they move a pawn, and then I move this pawn. And I've unleashed both of my bishops already, completely looking into their position. And of course my opponent could do the same, because in this variant, whenever you have your pieces shuffled, your opponents are exactly symmetrical to yours, right? So they have their two bishops, but here they haven't advanced these pawns yet, and so I think I might be able to get some kind of advantage because I'm looking for the bishops. So they develop their knight out. Now I go with opening principles, trying to fight for the center. They capture, I bring out my bishop. They play knight f6, and we're playing a pretty normal game so far with good opening principles. Knight g3. Now they're trying to get one of their bishops out. I develop my bishop, and actually my opponent did a really good idea, the same exact thing that I was saying, where now both of their bishops are active. And so I have to retreat my bishop here so it's not attacked. They play d5, fighting for the center. And then here I actually didn't play super accurately, but I ended up capturing, they captured back, and then just to try and get my king out of the way, I castled. And so long term, this actually might be a little too risky in hindsight, because maybe they have c4 and starting to rip open my position, but the point stands that opening principles are still useful, and in this position, I really do like my bishops here. Alright, so now what is the next piece of advice that'll really help beginners with this variant, and kind of also help them with transferring these skills to regular chess? So the next one is looking at square weaknesses that are on the 2nd or 7th rank. So in this case, it would be here on the 2nd rank or the 7th rank. So in regular chess here, we'll notice that the pieces are not really in the best of coordination when they're at the very beginning, which is why we have to develop our pieces. But some squares are weaker than others. And so really the weakest square, as you might know, f2 or f7. These squares tend to be weak, and sometimes are sacrifices which lure out the king, most often with a knight or a bishop. And so why are these squares so weak? Well, let's take a look at all of them. So we're going to look at black's camp here. And then, of course, white's will be the exact same thing, because the pieces are just mirrored. So here, if we look at this a7 pawn, it is already defended by this rook. And if we look at this b7 pawn, well, this is already defended by their bishop. And this pawn, of course, is defended by their queen. Same thing with these pawns. And those pawns are also defended by other pieces as well, too. And this pawn, also defended by the rook. And then, finally, this pawn is defended by their bishop. So what's the one pawn that we left out? And that's this one, which is the absolute weakest pawn in their camp, because it is only defended by their king. And their king is, of course, much more vulnerable, and if they were to capture here, they lose castling rights, which is something they generally don't want, because they want to get castled. So here, f7 is really weak, potentially, and so is f2. And so how does this apply to this variant that we have? So in this variant here, it's a little bit different, because when the pieces are shuffled, there's different squares that we have to be looking at. So here, let's just go through real briefly in this exact configuration. What is weak? Well, both of these pawns here are defended by their bishop. So, this way here. So that's no good for us. And so here, same thing. This bishop and the rook is defending. Okay, fine. So that's pretty secure. Very similar as what we saw with the regular chess. The queen defends a lot of pawns here. So that's pretty secure as well. And then the rook is securing this one. And so what is the one pawn that's actually really weak in this configuration? It's the last pawn we looked at. There's actually nothing defending this pawn. And so when you play this variant, sometimes it's useful to look at some kind of little cheap trick ideas. What happens if I attack their weakest pawn? And so this game, I actually noticed this right away. And so they played b4, developing their potentially strong a1 bishop. But I play b6. And my idea, of course, is I want to get my bishops both active, as we mentioned in an earlier point. My opponent is doing the same. They're trying to unleash the scope of both their bishops. And so both of us are playing pretty well so far. They play b5, trying to keep it closed, I suppose. And I want to develop. But why do I choose this knight? Well, keep in mind, I was looking at this pawn from the very beginning. I noticed this is weak, and we could actually take it. So why don't I take this pawn yet? The reason why is because in this variant, everything is symmetrical. And so if I were to capture here, then notice that they can actually capture here. And I haven't really gained anything because both sides have the same thing. So I choose to develop my knight to g6, but really I'm actually blocking off them from taking my pawn. So they don't see my threat, they just develop a normal move, knight to e3, and then I'm sure a surprise to them is when my bishop now shoots all the way across the board and captures this pawn. But it's more than just winning a pawn, because sometimes when you have these cheaper tricks like that, usually there might be another piece that you can take that's on the back rank. Oftentimes it'll even be a rook. And so that is exactly what we have here. This rook is actually trapped. So they're not just losing a pawn. They have to move some piece to develop. And if I don't see it, then they'll play here and save the rook. But of course I do see it. And so I'm going to take their bit with my bishop. They take back. And already I'm up material because at the very start of the game, I was looking at what squares are potentially weak. And so this is why it's very important to not only develop, but also be aware of what weaknesses you have, even at the very start of the game, because your pieces are not developed yet. And there's a lot of things that need to get coordinated as the game goes on. So sometimes you can actually target those before you get too far into the game. Now on that same note, it's not always a cheap trick with winning material. Sometimes you can actually use that idea of looking at weak squares to actually do a little bit more damage than just win material. And so here we're actually going to look at the same thing here. Now we'll kind of look very briefly at the squares. We'll see that the queen is controlling all of these. So all three of these pawns here aren't too weak, so that's one thing to note. Now this pawn here is weak, We have no way to exploit that right away, but notice that this is a free pawn because nothing is defending it. Now these are controlled because of course the bishop here, the rook here, and the knight here. So all three of these pawns are defended. And then the last one is this pawn here, which looks like the most obvious candidate because here we have a queen that could potentially put more pressure on that pawn. So with that in mind, I might want to be attacking the a7 pawn as the game goes on. So I develop my a1 bishop by pushing this b pawn. They develop their knight, also potentially guarding the square against my queen, so perhaps they saw this idea. I continue development, again putting the knight on one of the key squares that we like. And then they play h6, which maybe they were concerned about that pawn, and so they wanted to advance it so it's not weak. But there are some score weaknesses with that move, so I'm not really a huge fan of it, but we'll see how this progresses. I develop, they continue to do the same. I castle, which is kind of funny, but remember the castling is where they would end up. So in this case, they literally just flip locations. My opponent does the same. Of course, I'm going to try and unleash my scope here on their king. Both my bishop and my queen are kind of looking on their king side. They play c5. I develop my bishop, again adding more pressure to their castle king. They perhaps got a little bit nervous and moved their knight back. And now here we actually have kind of a quick, cheaper idea that we can do because we were looking at these key squares at the very beginning of the game. So in this case, we can actually remove the defender by playing bishop captures f6. They have to capture back, and in this case, they have to go with the g-pawn because if they take this way, well then this is actually checkmate in 1. So they have to be very careful there, and they have to take with the g-pawn, which unfortunately for them ruins their structure. Now, I still have bishop to h7 check, and they actually resigned in this position because they saw that after the king moves up, I have a checkmate with knight to h5. So the idea is in this game, just like the last one we looked at, I'm actually attacking their weaknesses at the very beginning because I'm identifying what square is potentially weak. And this is kind of good practice because in a regular chess game, your pieces start in the same location, but when the back rank is completely shuffled, it gives you more practice as a beginner to start looking at potential weaknesses and ways to potentially target those weaknesses. So that's a very useful skill to have that this variant can teach you, and you can transfer those skills to regular chess. Now I will say one other thing, one little bit of advice here, is that whenever you're playing this variant, most common is 3-minute blitz for the live 960 time control. Now, this is not the only time control you can play. There is also, 5-minute, and there is also 10-minute, and so you don't have to play really short time controls. You can actually even play a daily chess. So I believe this variant is a daily 960, and so you can also do that as well. But if you want to try a variant that also is not too much for, hurting your chances as a beginner, this is a really good variant to learn. And so one thing I really like about this variant a lot is in almost all the games, after about 20 moves or so, or about halfway into the game, all the positions look like positions you'd get in a regular game. And all my advice, you might have noticed, is mostly for the opening stage of this game. So I hope this video was helpful for everyone, and maybe it gave you some ideas on how you can play this variant and try and use it to help your chess. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.